Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our spring Newman lecture, The Place of Religion in the Scientific Revolution, with our speaker, Dr. Lawrence M. Principe. This is the third installment in our lecture series on faith and reason. Whether you're a student, faculty member, or member from the larger community, we want to welcome you to this talk. My name is Becca Bradley, and beside me is my good friend, Connor Kelly. We work with the Newman Center at Oregon State University, which is a Catholic campus ministry, to put on events like this one for the greater OSU community.
So, as Becca mentioned, my name is Connor. I graduated from American University in the summer of 2024, and I moved to Oregon this past August to work with the Newman Center. I've been attending Newman lectures for the past year, both in person at American University and in the form of online webinars streamed from here at Oregon State University. And through this series, I've been exposed to intellectual formation that's both expanded my worldview and deepened my own understanding of Christianity, the church, and my own faith.
We especially would like to welcome anyone who is here for their first Newman lecture. Dr. Principe is just one of the amazing speakers who is presenting on thought-provoking topics surrounding philosophy, social issues, and religious belief. We anticipate that through this lecture and participant questions, together we can come to a deeper understanding of how science and faith complement each other.
So, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to explain the order of the night. Dr. Principe will present for about 45 minutes, and then following his presentation, there will be time for questions. Becca and I will be at the front of each of the aisles with microphones, and will prompt you when it's your turn to ask a question. We welcome all questions, however, for the sake of time and so that we can get to as many people as possible, we request that you only ask one question and try to make it as concise as possible, please. Thank you. And now, the director of the Newman Center, Father John Potts, is going to share a couple of words with us.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you, Becca. So on behalf of the Newman Center at Oregon State University, we want to welcome you to this winter edition of our Newman Lectures. In a world that sways between rationalism and emotivism, these Newman Lectures want to foster the important dialogue and discussion between faith and science and show their harmony. Cardinal Newman, after whom these lectures are named, was very convinced about this compatibility, and therefore he promoted this dialogue. In one of his lectures as rector of the University of Dublin in Ireland, he said that he who believes revelation is sure, and nothing shall make him doubt, that if anything seems to be proved by astronomer or geologist or chronologist or antiquarian or ethnologist in contradiction to the dogmas of faith, that point will eventually turn out, first, not to be proved, or secondly, not contradictory, or thirdly, not contradictory to anything really revealed, but to something which has been confused with revelation. So that is the point of also this lecture, to understand that these two worlds, the world of science, the world of faith, actually enlighten each other. So I would like to thank Dr. Principe in the first place for coming to speak here tonight. I also thank Jay Selori and the whole team that makes these lectures possible. Now allow me to introduce our speaker. Dr. Lawrence Principe is the Drew Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of the History of Science and the Department of Chemistry. He holds a double PhD. He has a PhD in Organic Chemistry from Indiana University and a PhD in the History of Science from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Principe's research focuses on the medieval and early modern periods, especially the history of alchemy and the science-religion dynamic. He is the author of more than 60 scholarly articles and over 10 books, including The Scientific Revolution, a very short introduction, which he was just telling me is the most popular one, written for a popular audience, and also The Secrets of Alchemy, which seems super interesting. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lawrence Principe.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all this evening, and thank you all for coming out here. I'm very pleased to see what a nice audience has appeared. So, I hope to give you some things to think about this evening, and maybe some things that are surprising, some things that aren't surprising, and I look forward to your questions at the end. I like questions very much. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. All right. Well, I probably hadn't said anything of importance yet as it was, so I'll try to see if I can correct that in the next 40 minutes. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you. Right. All right. So, well, we live today in a world of science and technology. Our thinking about the natural world and about ourselves is molded by outlooks and metaphors that are borrowed from science and technology. So a couple of questions come out of that. How did this state of affairs come to be? And what does that mean for the philosophies and for the religions that are expressed in different terms that come from a different age? So many fundamental conceptions about the universe we inhabit date from one of the most transformational periods in the history of science, namely the scientific revolution. So I think it makes sense for us to look there first for some answers. So before I get into my lecture, I need to make sure we're all on the same page. Some of my students in the past have imagined that when I start talking about the scientific revolution or the early modern period, I'm referring to the 1990s, which, if true, would mean that I was born in the Middle Ages. And the more I think about that, the more appealing that sounds. But when historians actually speak about the scientific revolution, we mean the 16th and the 17th centuries. Because there, many of the most famous historical scientists lived in that period. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Harvey, Boyle, Newton, just to rattle off a few names. This is the time when a sun-centered cosmos replaced an earth-centered one, when the moon and planets were found to be made out of the same constituents as the earth, when the regular motions of the heavenly bodies were explained, the circulation of the blood demonstrated, the foundations of classical physics established, the first scientific societies and academies founded, the new world discovered and explored by denizens of the old, and the cosmos mathematized, quantified, and cataloged like never before. And it was also when mechanical, technological metaphors began replacing more organic, natural ones, and when human beings began reconceptualizing what their place in the universe actually was. So while all of these points are largely agreed on, there are other claims, particularly relating to the relationship between science and religion, that are considerably less reliable. And chief among these is the assertion that the progress of scientific knowledge during the scientific revolution and afterwards down to our own day brought faith and reason into conflict. In short, that science progressively displaces or replaces religion. So that means that some people will see the scientific revolution as a turning point for both science and religion, depending on your perspectives, a positive one for science, a negative one for religion. But that perspective, as I'll try to demonstrate, is demonstrated on a number of historical errors and originates from retrospective assertions motivated by social, political, and personal aims dating from almost 2 centuries later. So let's look at these claims and some of their origins. Oops, that was not the right button. All right, okay. So here are the 3 interrelated claims that I'm going to talk about this evening. So 1, that the crafters of the scientific revolution were themselves non-religious or irreligious, that faith and religion played either a negative or an adversarial role or no significant role in the scientific revolution, so by extension afterwards as well. And 3, that the relationship between science and religion, I think this is a very important one, that the relationship is a zero-sum game. That is, as one advances, the other must necessarily retreat. So let's start at the beginning with the first one. that the crafters of the scientific revolution were non-religious or irreligious or somehow needed to break from religion in order to do science. Well, to professional historians of science today, speaking as one, this claim is so absurd that it seems beneath our notice. That has not, however, stopped many popular writers and a fair number of scientists from repeating it as if it were true. And I will leave without mention the various babblings of the internet. The evidence to the contrary is so overwhelming, I'm just going to cite a few examples. So, I'll get the right button this time. There we are. Robert Boyle, a champion of chemistry and the discoverer of the fundamental gas law that bears his name, was called in his eulogy a lay bishop. And his many books divide evenly between scientific and theological topics. In fact, his most popular book was a book of Christian devotion. Isaac Newton devoted at least as much time to theology, Christology, and biblical studies as he did to mathematics or physics. Now, yes, he might well have been a heretic. He denied the divinity of Christ, but he was not irreligious. The general Scholium, in his famous Principia Mathematica, the book that sets the foundations for celestial mechanics based on a notion of universal gravitation, contains substantial theological speculations as well, and he firmly states, and I quote him, "To discourse of God from the appearances of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy." A long list of scientific work and achievements was carried out by those in holy orders. In the middle of the 17th century, ancient concepts of atomism were revived and extended by the French priest Pierre Gassendi. The foundational principles of geology and stratigraphy were enunciated, and the true nature of fossils as the relics of ancient living creatures demonstrated by Niels Steno, or Niels Stenson. I should decide whether I want to call him by his Latin name or his Danish name. So Niels Stenson or Nicholas Steno, who converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism and then became a priest, was made a bishop, and is now, by the way, a beatus. A list of 17th century Jesuits reads like a roster of significant scientific discoverers. Start with one of my favorites, Giovanni Battista Riccioli, measured quite accurately the gravitational acceleration of falling bodies by dropping weights from the Leaning Tower of Bologna. Now, you may have heard at some point that Galileo did this by dropping weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa. No, Galileo never did that. It's a conflation with what Riccioli did in Bologna. For one thing, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is too short to do any kind of measurements that way. Here, as you can see, the Asinelli Tower here is quite large and still leans. Actually, an interesting bit about this is, as you can imagine, the amount of time for a ball to fall from the top of this tower to the ground is not very long, and they did not have good clocks in the 17th century. And so one of the things that he had, he tried to get a pendulum that would beat 1 second exactly so he could measure that. And then he was going to make a pendulum that would beat 1/6 of a second. Well, how do you calibrate it? The only thing you can calibrate it by is astronomical things, by the stars. So when he thought he got it right, he would have the Jesuit novices sit there and count the number of oscillations from one solar noon to the next solar noon. He got within about 2% of the value he wanted before the novices revolted. And so finally, when he was actually doing this, what he had a bunch of Jesuits sitting at the bottom, chanting very, very quickly a very well-known chant, and then they would mark at what syllable the balls hit particular parts of the tower. And still, he got a very good result this way. He also mapped the moon, giving its craters and seas the names we use today. If you look at a map of the moon, you will find that there are 32 craters named after Jesuits. And there's the reason. One of my favorites, again, is Athanasius Kircher, who was interested in everything in the world, but my favorite story of him is he was traveling through southern Italy when Vesuvius erupted in 1632, and he had himself carried into the erupting crater to make observations of volcanism. And he concluded that because there was so much fire and molten rock coming out, it couldn't just be that the interior of the mountain was on fire, but instead that the earth must have a molten core that was channeling molten rock to the surface. One more Jesuit, Francesco Maria Grimaldi, first observed, described, and studied the diffraction of light, a phenomenon was satisfactorily explained only in the early 20th century. And the topics of magnetism, optics, and seismology were at various times virtually Jesuit monopolies. In fact, the Jesuits were the first to teach Galileo's new science of motion. And having mentioned Galileo, who is so frequently cited as exhibit number 1 in the conflict between science and religion, it's necessary to point out that he remained Catholic to the end of his life. In fact, a colleague has recently discovered that in 1630 he actually accepted the tonsure to take a low order of holy orders. His letter to Grand Duchess Christina, which were intended to answer her questions about the theological consequences, if any, based on the hypothesis of heliocentrism in a moving earth, is a masterpiece of theological reasoning based firmly in the exegetical tradition of St. Augustine, which he clearly knew very well. In fact, one of his early missteps was trying to reinterpret Scripture on his own to fit an unproven hypothesis of his, which turned out to be incorrect. This was a very unwise undertaking in the days when the Reformation was busy throwing out centuries of learned biblical commentary and exegesis in favor of personal interpretations. Now, I can say more about Galileo in the question period if you like, but for now I will just point out that his supporters and detractors were evenly distributed among ecclesiastics and laymen. Both criticism and support of his ideas were based on both theological and scientific knowledge. While some churchmen and secular professors criticized his ideas, others praised him. The Jesuits gave him a celebratory feast to mark his discoveries, and Galileo himself liked to quote Cardinal Cesare Baronio, who liked to quote, "The intention of the Holy Spirit is to tell us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go." Now, the second fallacy, that religion and faith played either no role or a negative and adversarial role in the scientific revolution, again, could not be further from the truth. One of the primary motivations for the study of the sciences throughout the period was, in fact, religious and devotional. Study of the natural world was seen as the study of God at one remove. By studying the created works of God, these investigators believed they were revealing God's thought, another line in the blueprint of creation, so to speak. And this outlook follows the concept of the two books enunciated by the patristic authors, and particularly St. Augustine, which holds that God reveals himself in multiple ways. First, by inspiring, not dictating to, inspiring the sacred writers to pen the books of the Bible, and by the act of creating the world, which he called the book of nature. The scientists of the scientific revolution sought to read the book of nature to learn not only about nature itself, but also to learn what it says about its creator. The universe was then to them, in a sense, a kind of first incarnation, for everything simply by existing reveals in a particular way, in its own particular way, God. Now, Galileo himself taps into this idea when he writes about what he calls, quote, "that great book which is ever before our eyes, I mean the universe," end quote, which to his eyes was written in a language of mathematics. And it's crucial to remember that thinkers of the scientific revolution had a much broader vision than most modern scientists. They looked out on a world that was deeply, deeply interrelated, a true cosmos with meaningful relationships everywhere that inextricably linked human beings, the natural world, and God. Now, Galileo's contemporary, oh, I missed to show you a picture of Galileo. There he is. Galileo's contemporary, the astronomer Johannes Kepler, who enunciated the 3 fundamental laws of planetary motion, once lamented to his teacher, quote, "I wanted to be a theologian, and I was sad for a long time about that. But," he concluded, "now I see how God is praised just as well by my work in astronomy." Robert Boyle thought it was particularly appropriate to do chemical experiments on Sundays, yes, because they were, in his mind, a form of worship. Now, note that this viewpoint stretched all across the 3 main Christian denominations of the day, because I've just cited a Catholic, a Lutheran, and an Anglican. Others thought that scientific findings might be useful in practical theological matters. The Minim priest Marin Mersenne studied what is called the mechanical philosophy, a worldview that holds that the functioning of the universe is like that of a great machine, regular and predictable, because he hoped that if we learned all of nature's regular laws, that would help us solve the thorny problem of discerning whether or not a remarkable event was natural or miraculous. So the discernment of miracles. To return for a moment to Kepler, he used his mathematical and geometrical expertise to argue that Luther's doctrine of the consubstantiation of the Eucharist could not possibly be true, and thus either the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation or the Calvinist symbolic view had to be correct. He was excommunicated by the Lutheran Church for his efforts, though, unfortunately. The churches, particularly Catholic Church as an institution, fostered scientific study. Most obviously, it was the church that established and funded the universities, which had grown out of earlier cathedral schools. Copernicus, there he is. Copernicus was a canon in the cathedral church in Krakow, and he dedicated his book on heliocentrism to Pope Paul III. There's the dedication up there. You don't dedicate something to someone unless you know it's going to get a good reception, which it did. Copernicus had been to Rome earlier in the century in 1515 and 1516, where he was invited to give a lecture on heliocentrism to the College of Cardinals and the Pope, Pope Leo X, who encouraged him, please, this is really important, please write this down. Unfortunately, Copernicus was such a busy man as a canon of the Cathedral Church of Krakow, he never had a chance to do it. He had to hire people, but there were several churchmen who offered to pay for secretaries. I wish someone would offer to pay for a secretary for me to come and take dictation or do whatever it is to get the book through the press, which is how it was, in fact, eventually printed. Let's see, where was I? Right. Likewise, the orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits in particular, built the first global networks of correspondence and exchange. New scientific information and materials flowed back to Rome through far-flung Jesuit missionaries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. And the historian of science, Richard Westphal, whom I like to consider as one of my tutors in my days at Indiana University, has argued that until the era of large-scale government-funded research in the 20th century, the Catholic Church was easily the greatest patron of the arts and the sciences. So, how can it be, given all this evidence to the contrary, that the ideas of an inherent conflict between science and religion continue to be common narratives today? Well, strikingly, the origin of what many historians now call the idea that wouldn't die lies predominantly in the late 19th century. So, as an early modernist and now a medievalist, that's yesterday. So now what I'm going to be talking about is virtually journalism to me. And it centers on two people. These two people, John William Draper, a physiologist and first president, I'm ashamed to say, of the American Chemical Society, and Andrew Dixon White, a New York State senator and first president of Cornell University. Starting in the 1870s, both men wrote books chronicling what they described as an eternal conflict or warfare between science and Christianity. There are their books. White was more prolific, publishing numerous articles in Popular Science Monthly and a massive 2-volume compilation in 1896. Draper was the more popular. His book, published in a series for science popularizations, far outsold every other title in the series. Yet, these writings are nothing more than a jumble of historical errors, misrepresentations, and outright fabrications. The evidence is cherry-picked at best and twisted to fit the author's designs. Hey, but wait, you say, you're thinking, how much impact could these 150-year-old books have? Who in the audience has ever read either one of these? Yeah, that's the answer I always get. Okay, I've read them, right? I had to for this talk. Let me ask you a second question then. How many of you at some point in your educational career were told that before Columbus, people thought that the earth was flat? Okay, well, you see, you did get something out of their books, didn't you? Because that myth, which drives historians of science nuts, because the rotundity of the earth was well established by the 5th century BC by Aristotle, and if you were in a medieval university, the first thing you would have to read to get your degree was De Sphera, which began with several chapters demonstrating why the earth is round. But as you see, falsehoods take hold in popular culture. And that falsehood, along with many others, such as, for example, that the Catholic Church forbade dissections, when in fact, to get a medical degree by 1300, you had to be present at a dissection. And some of the early, well, we can go on about that. Historians of science, we like to push on these issues. Oh, right, here you are. Here's a cartoon for you, while I figure out what my next statement is. For those of you who like Tolkien. So, many of the common historical errors repeated today can be traced back to these two books. The errors and outlooks they promoted have become naturalized as facts in popular culture. Well, the dubious facts upon which these books rest are easy to point out and refute, and historians have been doing it for the last 50 years or more, so I'm not going to do it here. I'd like instead to say just a couple words about their origins. White's full, because I think we know more about a thing when we know where it comes from. Okay? Aristotle would agree. So it must be right. So White's fulminations about science and religion resulted from his actions in founding Cornell University. As a New York senator, he redirected funds, government funds, from the 1862 Land Grant Act away from existing colleges in the state in order to found a new one, Cornell. And when he left the Senate to become the institution's first president, and his senatorial ally, Ezra Cornell, obtained exclusive control over the finances and had the new college named after him, the colleges that lost out made accusations of impropriety, and I think not entirely unreasonably. Now, since most other colleges were denominational, as was the norm for colleges in the 19th century, White, rather than meeting the accusations directly, instead turned the affair into a matter of science versus religion, which it wasn't. It was about money, like usual. White's writings on science and religion are not dispassionate history, certainly not accurate history, but they're over-the-top and wildly misdirected responses to personal criticism. A contemporary reviewer wrote, quote, about White's final book, quote, "An indiscriminate and uncritical agglomeration brought together for the support of a thoroughly one-sided and fatally misleading proposition. A piece of special pleading like this was not worth writing." I try to think what I would do if someone wrote a review like that of one of my books. I think I'd just stop writing or just have a breakdown. Anyway, Draper's thought can be characterized as an obsession with law. He moves sequentially from the inanimate world through plants, animals, human beings, and human civilization, arguing that all life and development are governed entirely by impersonal, inescapable law, what he called a universal law of development. His conflict between religion and science continues this obsession with supposed law, but adds a melodramatic, in fact hysterical, tone. Its vitriolic fulminations are not turned against religion in general, but specifically against Catholicism. Indeed, the work is little more than an anti-Catholic rant. Draper considers Protestantism the twin sister of science, such that he says that anytime any Protestant ever had any problem with science, it's because, quote, they were incompletely emancipated from Catholicism. Yeah. He calls Islam the Southern Reformation, carried out by a people ever benevolent to science and progress, while Catholicism is the brutal enemy of science, progress, and civilization. I'll let you read that. Well, Draper's rabidity expresses the anti-Catholicism that is so deeply entrenched in American society and contemporaneous panic over Catholic immigration. So nice that we live in enlightened times when people aren't worried about such things. But Draper's family history also plays a role. His father, a Methodist minister, was a convert to Methodism, which resulted in his ostracism by the rest of the Draper family, which was, wait for it, of course, Catholic. Much of the book's success and continued popularity, in fact, depended on its anti-Catholicism. Its publisher, gleeful over the money the book was raking in hand over fist, asserted that any criticism of it came only from, and I quote, the outside sects, Jews, Unitarians, and Catholics, whom the Orthodox repudiate as knowing nothing of true religion. Thanks. Reviewers panned the book. A more hasty, pretentious, incorrect work claiming the title of history has seldom fallen into our hands, wrote Scribner's Monthly. Well, despite the historical bankruptcy of both books, they have set the tone for popular ideas about science and religion down to our day. But they did have helpers. There was also the background of Auguste Comte, his positivism. In the 1840s, he proposed that all societies develop in 3 stages. Draper's own law of development is essentially a, frankly, rather cartoonish recasting of Comte. His 3 stages, Comte's that is, were the religious or theological, followed by the philosophical, followed by the scientific or positive stage. So when you hear the claim that religion is primitive and science is advanced, what you're really hearing is an echo of Comte, even if the speaker has never heard of the French philosopher. Something that's been bothering me, so I'm going to try it out on this audience. Here, this is where historians and professors always go off on tangents. Go to an archaeological museum, and they dig up artifacts that are like 3,000, 4,000 years old, where we don't have any written sources about the people. They find a statuette, a female statuette, and immediately it's labeled in the museum, cult figure. Because obviously, if they're 3,000 or 4,000 years old, everything must have to do with religion. You know, maybe it was his girlfriend, you know, or his mother, or something. But I find this constantly in archaeological museums, that the assumption is everything is a cult figure. You know, just put that in the back of your minds, or forget about it if you think it's stupid. But when you're in an archaeological museum, sort of think about that. It just seems the go-to proposition without evidence. All right. Well, a surprising cast of characters perpetuated these views through the 20th century, and one group were the techno-utopianists, who believed that social, political, and moral systems had to be replaced with scientism and technology. And their views generally included as well socialist politics, materialist ideology, a world government, and the abolition of religion. And a key figure in this was the writer H.G. Wells. Now, you probably know him mostly for his science fiction, books he wrote in the 1890s, The Invisible Man, War of the Worlds, Time Machine. But his post-World War I writings were far more influential. His 1919 Outline of History was possibly the best-selling history book of all time. It repeatedly and consistently casts religion as the enemy of human progress. And he takes a lot of stuff out of Draper and White, not surprisingly. Professional historians rejected the work, but again, it became a worldwide bestseller. Why do we do what we do when nobody listens? I feel like a parent sometimes. So throughout the 1920s, the 30s, and the 40s, like-minded voices from the sciences continued this story, such as this man, J.B.S. Haldane, a physiologist, a materialist, an evolutionary biologist, very successful science popularizer. If you've ever heard the term primordial soup, he made it up. And propagandist for the Soviet Union. Here he is haranguing a gang in London. And often on new BBC radio broadcasts. Indeed, although I haven't time to explore it tonight, such activities in the early and mid-20th century continue in a remarkably clear line of descent down to the present-day prophets of scientism. It's quite remarkable, the lineage here. But religion itself, and now we have to look at the other side of the coin, that is, a particular subset of theology, and I would say bad theology, bears a good part of the blame as well. And this point returns us to the scientific revolution and the third point on my list. Since the time of the scientific revolution, it has often looked like science is successfully replacing religion as an explanation of our world. But this need not have been the case. What I have in mind is the God of the gaps problem, namely the consequences when direct divine action is used to fill in gaps in explanations of natural events or phenomena. We don't explain how something came to be, how something happened, and then so we say God did it. In that case, I should just quote Thomas Aquinas in this case, quote, "Is there anything more stupid than to say God does something just because he can?" So the God of the gaps itself originates in the scientific revolution. A classic example comes from Isaac Newton himself in material he gave to Richard Bentley for his Boyle lectures of 1692 and 1693. Newton has observed telescopically that the velocities of Jupiter and Saturn were changing. One planet was slowing down, the other one was speeding up. And he recognized that if that change continued, our solar system would become unstable. But since the system had remained stable, Newton suggested, God must intervene from time to set the system right. Now, not only does this argument make God seem a rather incompetent workman who could not design a stable system in the first place, but 70 years later, the French astronomer Simon Laplace discovered exactly how the system corrects itself. So God had one fewer thing to do. And the same issue bedevils the argument from design, another development of the late 17th century, namely that complex structures like the eye and the hand need to have a direct designer, i.e. God, and thus their existence proves his existence. But these multiple arguments from design, most famously put together by William Paley in the beginning of the 19th century, were undermined by the discovery of evolution and natural selection. Again, God had one fewer thing to do, religion had picked the wrong horse, and so a natural extrapolation would be that God is unnecessary and religion always gets it wrong. Of course, this ignores the fact that many of the gaps from which God was squeezed out were actually closed by religious believers. Just to name two, the monk Gregor Mendel for genetics, the priest Georges Lemaitre for Big Bang cosmology. The point is that God of the gaps arguments were a bad move from the beginning, one of the negative developments of the scientific revolution. And it was largely a move in England to combat what they believed was a rising tide of atheism. In other words, if you didn't believe the Bible, if you didn't believe what your preacher was telling you, you could look out at the world and prove that God existed and had certain attributes that way. Now, don't get me wrong, wonder at the natural world can certainly intensify devotion in a believer and urge one on towards discovering more about the world. That's a kind of natural theology that works. The problem is when it becomes a theological argument. It doesn't have that strength. It's very weak, as the God of the Gaps problem shows. But it didn't need to be so. The use of divine activity to explain features of the natural move was a bad move from the start. And much, not all, of what is perceived today as a conflict between science and religion stems from errors in the assignment of causation that is generally linked to bad theology and bad exegesis. Think of the unnecessary turmoil and the effects it has on what people think of science and religion caused by fundamentalist insistence on special creation instead of evolution, or a young Earth created in a short time period rather than an ancient Earth and universe. One of my colleagues has recently published a book that shows that even in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, people often thought of an extremely ancient Earth, and there were no religious arguments against it whatsoever. Naive biblical literalism plays a big role, the kind of things that St. Augustine warned us against, and its origins too date from the period of the scientific revolution. Medieval theologians would not have made either mistake. They saw calling in direct divine action as an explanation as an intellectual cop-out. In doing so, those theologians produced a form of methodological naturalism. Now, what is methodological naturalism? It's a rule of the game, basically, namely that only natural causation counts as a comprehensible explanation of natural events. And that is, in fact, central to the enterprise of modern science. They expressed reliance on the operation of natural causes, powers implanted in creation at the beginning. For example, when you go to make tea in the morning and you put the kettle on the fire, God does not have to make the fire burn, because fire, at the moment of its creation, had the power of heating, it has a natural power. In other words, God shares some of his creative activity with the creation. So as an example, I'm going to cite for you one of my favorite examples. It comes from St. Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics. So Aristotle, he lived among a ship of seafaring people. He liked ship metaphors a lot and ship illustrations. So he says, well, how does a ship come to be? Well, we take wood, which has no power of its own, and we take the shipbuilder, and the shipbuilder has in his mind the way that the ship is supposed to go together, and so puts the ship together. Okay, fine. St. Thomas, highlighting the difference between artificial objects, like a ship, and a natural object, says, in the natural world, get this, this is great, you need to imagine this, it is as if the shipbuilding art were in the wood so it could assemble itself into a ship. It's a very different view of things. So such theologians also knew how to interpret the Bible, following Augustinian principles, which include using demonstrated scientific knowledge to improve biblical exegesis rather than reading the Bible as if it were a scientific textbook. Thus, I think it's right to say that while science and Christianity were not in conflict during the scientific revolution, and that scientific thinkers of the period were themselves religious believers, and that the churches supported science, it is also the case that some of the developments that would later unnecessarily, in my view, bring science and Christianity into conflict, I refer to reliance on natural theology and God of the Gaps arguments, and the erosion of methodological naturalism and informed biblical exegesis, also draw their origins from the same period. These consequent problems, of course, became far worse with the rise of fundamentalism in early 20th century America and its more reprehensible forms of the early 21st century, but that's a different story that I have neither time nor the stomach to include in this talk. So in conclusion, I hope I've given you some information and maybe some insights to think about and succeeded in clarifying the content and impact of the scientific revolution in relating its innovations, both positive and negative, to subsequent developments down to our own day. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Principe. I really liked your presentation. I especially appreciate your point about how falsehoods take root in popular culture, even though they're not necessarily based in truth, but more on our pre-existing biases that we have. So thank you.
Awesome. So at this point, we're going to have some time for questions. If you want to line up on either aisle, you have an opportunity to ask a question. Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
So thank you for a fantastic lecture. You're a great speaker, and it's a pleasure to have you in Oregon. So I would not completely blame just the atheists that wrote those books for the conflict. When I was going to school in Poland, I had religious education and science, and I learned about evolution and went back to my priest and said, what are you talking about about Genesis? You know, there was evolution. And he said, oh, no, don't listen to them. And it took me away from church for many years until I wonder what's if the priests in America now, we could ask one, get, if we believe that all the priests really, say Genesis is a story, and, this is my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it goes to the heart of how important education at various levels is and for various people. Now, John Paul II, for example, did make a statement that, evolution is more than a hypothesis. It's a demonstrated theory. So I think there is better education. We still need more of it, I think. I was involved for a short time with the American Academy of Arts, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, who is producing a program called Science for Seminaries, which is a set of video lectures for seminarians. I certainly personally have never had anyone in the church ever say anything to me against anything like that. So it is always a matter of, the church is made up of individuals, right, as is society. So we just hope for more, I think there have been a lot of positive statements. I know certainly John Paul II was very interested in the relationship between science and religion. Pope Francis also is, and so there have been quite a fair number of encyclicals and teaching statements about that, on various topics. JP2 wrote Fides et Ratio, which is quite a lengthy encyclical on the proper relationship between science and religion.
The question is, what are kids taught in...
I'm glad you said that. Yes. Eugenie Scott, who is the head of, and I'm going to forget the name of her organization, but it monitors science teaching in secondary schools in the United States, did a survey of using evolution as the litmus test of how much evolution is being taught in various schools. And it turns out that more class hours, I think is the term, are devoted to evolution in Catholic schools than in public schools, because the public schools are afraid.
Great.
All right, that's really another question over here for you.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really awesome talk. I had a question about that point about natural causation that you had brought up. I had heard that the seed of, I think one thing that's interesting is the seed of science was really brought to bear in Catholic culture and whatnot. But I know that the Muslims also, the Muslim culture had advancements in mathematics and whatnot, but I had heard that due to particular theological developments in the Muslim culture, they denied that natural causation type thing and had the idea that God just acted on everything and just brought everything about, and that's ultimately what killed the seed of science in that culture. Is that true, or could you touch on that?
That is certainly an argument that has been made. And let me just explain for the rest of you who haven't read this argument. It actually focuses often on Al-Ghazali, who is one of the theologians and philosophers of the Islamic world. So there's some truth to it. There's not 100% truth to it, because just like within Christianity, there's a wide variety of beliefs within within Islam. The problem is that one thing that Muslims are concerned about in particular is what they call associationism. That is, associating anything with the deity. And so the idea for them, for some of them, for God sharing his powers with the created world is a kind of associationism, and so is theologically unacceptable. So they have the idea, the people who believe this have the idea that instead of actual motion, for example, what God does is recreate the universe at every infinitesimal moment in time. So if I throw a ball to you, the ball isn't actually moving, it's that God is recreating it infinitesimally closer to you at every moment. So I think I buy the argument that that is not necessarily going to promote the idea of natural causation, unless of course, you believe that God has made some kind of covenant with us that he will only do things in a very particular way. And so then the natural laws that you're reading would be the kind of covenant that God makes, rather than something in the natural world. However, the argument does hold water at some level. I don't think it's 100%, but it's an interesting thing to think about and to pursue further.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for coming here, Doc. I just had a question about thermodynamics. Are you familiar with it? And does the church think about using it to explain or bring closer the relationship of science to religion?
Not that I mean, yes, I am familiar with thermo. I suffered through a class on that when I was a junior. Condolences for any of you who are still going through that class. But no, I don't know of that in particular being used.
I have the answer. We had a talk on it last year with Father Spitzer. He summarized all of the thermodynamics and like beginning of the whole physics stuff, and basically came to scientifically you can prove that the universe had to be created by a god or somebody because there isn't any other real explanation for how that could have happened, and it had to have had a beginning, which means it could have just existed forever. But you can't prove anything beyond that of like, this is what God is like. You're just like, we're pretty sure it had to be created. So it's at once like strong, but also not very far going.
Okay. Well, thank you for that.
One of the rules that caught my mind is everything's always in a state of decay. But, yeah.
Moving towards entropy, yes.
Yeah,
But
and, we're here still. So it kind of supports the intelligent design theory.
I don't really buy that argument, honestly. Yeah. But thanks.
We can take another question over here.
Thank you very much for the talk. One of the questions I have is in regards to the Soviet republics and the main implementation of Karl Marx's work, which was very anti-religious. How much of an effect did that have on the West view of science and religion? And how much did the East view, as well as that of China? It is about a seventh of the world's population, as well as India.
Wow, that's a really big question that I don't know that I'm particularly well qualified to answer. What I can answer for you is that a number of the people that I didn't bother talking about through the 20th century also tended to have Marxist leanings, and certainly materialism. I think the more the interesting question that comes out of it, I can twist your question a little bit to something that maybe I can answer, is it's interesting, whereas people will say some people will say we have to get rid of religion because it gets in the way of science. They don't do the same thing with political systems. But you look at, for example, what happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin, for example, with Lysenko and any other, when there was some science that was okay and some science that you got sent to a gulag for doing. So, if we're going to be interested in looking at what promotes and what detracts from science, we need to have a broader view of it as well, I think. So, I know I didn't answer your question. That was a slippery way of me getting out of it.
Hey, fair's fair.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, we have another question over here.
Thank you for being here and giving us this wonderful talk. I have a question. The Jesuit is Pierre de Jardin,
Oh, yes.
who wrote The Phenomenon of Man. And it seems to me when I read that in college, there was a moment when somehow the self-awareness of the human being was sort of instilled along the way.
Mm-hmm.
That was one thing. I mean, it seems to me with the conflict between religion and science is when they get in each other's, how should I say, territory. And the other question is, I read a book recently called Why Is There Anything at All, Not That and Nothing? And it was by an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a question that I was proposed, or we talked about back in 1961 at Notre Dame. So anyway, both those things were kind of curious. I think they get into each other's, how should I say, territory.
Yeah, that's part of it, and not respecting each other's territory or the contributions that one can make to the other. I mean, I think Augustine was spot on there in saying, there's some things that people know for sure because they are demonstrably true, and so we need to consider those when we're reading scripture, for example. But I think it's also important to, you have the really strong atheists. I mean, do I mind there being atheists? No, not at all. I mean, you can make a philosophical argument for atheism. I think there are some problems with it personally, but you can hold it philosophically as a very intelligent person. On the other hand, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say about that. But there are people who are sort of knee-jerk atheists who have never thought about it, who tend to write books on science and religion, and just cast out of any value all of philosophy, all of theology, all of human endeavors to understand things in a really, I think, barbarous kind of way. The one person whose name I will not invoke here, who said, oh, well, philosophy is dead because science answers all our questions. I mean, what planet have you been living on? I mean, really, take about 30 seconds and you realize how empty that such a statement is. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. We'll take another question over here.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I really like what you were saying about how fundamentalism has created the false dichotomy of science and religion. And what I was kind of wondering is you mentioned that fundamentalism really came into play more in the 20th century. So I was curious if ideologies like that existed back in the scientific revolution, how prevalent they were, and what the response was.
Sure. Yeah. There's certain specificities about fundamentalism that mark it out as a particularly American, although it's spread, development of the early 20th century. I mean, it comes out of, let me answer your question first before I go on to that. Yeah, there probably were fundamentalist thinkers even in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. They just didn't get very far. Because, there was a high regard for learned biblical interpretation and learned theological sophistication. And so, for example, if you were a student in the Middle Ages, right, you'd go off to the university at probably about age 14, and you'd study for 3 or 4 years, and if you were really committed, you'd get your bachelor's degree, and then you'd study 2 more years to get a master's degree. And then you could go on to one of the higher faculties, medicine, law, or theology. So for law, you'd study for probably 2 more years. For medicine, you'd study for 4. For theology, probably 8 to 12. So the bar is extremely high for making statements, theological statements. Okay? So yeah, I'm sure that if you just went into the medieval village and knocked on a door and asked someone something, you would find someone that comes out, in a sense, like a fundamentalist. Right? But they didn't leave behind writings, and they probably didn't have very much impact. Fundamentalism in the United States comes out of a particular social and political constellation. So it surprises a lot of people to find out that by the end of the 19th century, most Christian denominations had adopted evolution. Not necessarily natural selection, but scientists hadn't either. But natural selection, evolution, yes. The fundamentalists reacted strongly against this and against liberal Protestantism. They reacted strongly against a country that was changing in ways they didn't understand, because fundamentalism is essentially a rural development of the South and the Midwest against the more educated East Coast, the establishment of the East Coast. Because better communication made them suddenly realize that, wow, our backwater town, I thought the whole world looked like this. Guess what? It doesn't. There are other people with other ideas out there. And that provoked a retrenchment of, well, right, they have give me that old-time religion, right? Something that doesn't make, quote, compromises with science, or recognize the way the world is changing. And so we can see much of that similar sort of thing happening in our own day, a sort of revival of that same socio-political landscape and the same kind of dire effects that it has.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that question. We can take another one over here.
Thank you for your talk. I was just curious to your knowledge how involved the various Eastern Orthodox churches are involved with scientific advancements.
Fantastic question. Fantastic question. We need to know so much more about what's going on in the East. The East, the whole Byzantine Empire is, and Eastern Orthodoxy is essentially a missing piece to the puzzle. And very, very few people have been working on that. A book has just come out very recently, last year, maybe even just a few months ago, on science and religion in Eastern Orthodoxy. Again, I, like my colleagues, don't know much about it. We're hoping to learn, but I think that the different way that the Eastern Church developed in its theology is going to give us a new kind of insight on the kind of interaction with science. I mean, one of the things to remember also is that the Eastern Church always knew how to speak Greek and read Greek, and so could read Aristotle and Plato, and had them, rather than us, myself, Latins, who had to wait to get Aristotle from the Arabs. So my prediction is we're going to find some really, really interesting stuff there. We're just not there yet. There are just a few people working on it right now. But thank you so much for that.
We have another question over here.
Thank you for being here. My question is less of a historical one, more of a practical one.
Yeah.
As faculty and students at such a great research institution where science is really the foundation, what can we do to help heal the fracture between religion and science here on this campus?
I think one of the first things to do is, naturally I'm going to say this as a historian, is sort of get your historical facts in order, okay? And realize what a wonderful thing science is and how much it can do for us, and the good and the bad. There's the good and the bad and the ugly in sciences as well, and in religion, because they're both practiced by humans, for better or for worse. But I think the first thing is, don't listen to myths. Get the stories right. There are lots of books out now. Let me see if I can plug for some of my colleagues' books. There's one called Galileo Goes to Jail, 20 Myths About Science and Religion, or something like that. And there's short articles that you can read in like 10 minutes, and 20 of them. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. And one of the frustrations I have as a professor who's spent now almost 40 years writing on this stuff, and I have colleagues who've been writing for longer, some of them doing a better job, and it just seems to take forever to get our ideas to percolate down into the public arena. Generally, it seems to me that it takes about 50 years for that to happen. And now we've got all this kind of newfangled technology. Now, shouldn't we be able to do better? I don't know. We'll see what happens. But you know, getting the history right and saying no when you hear something, saying no, that's not right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have another question over here.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciated all the points you made. And this is going to be another one of those like broad questions.
Okay.
Last one. But my history teacher in high school always told me that history is such a great discipline because by better understanding the past, we can understand the present. And so I guess, like with all of your kind of knowledge about this, you know, science versus religion kind of understanding that's been developed through the years, what does like maybe today's world look like? If you have any commentary on that, like maybe with the current discourse, or maybe what are the trends over the last few years?
So you're asking me to be a journalist again, are you? Well, I think I see a lot of positive signs, actually, and God knows we need positive signs. I think I see both in the sciences and particularly among many of the churches, a greater interest in talking about the issues that seem to divide us but don't necessarily. So I just mentioned a moment ago the sort of technological advances we have for broadcasting knowledge. I mean, properly used, these could be tremendously important ways for getting the word out or just getting people to think about things rather than to be complacent in what they've sort of imbibed from the culture. I mean, we all do that, right? We all have things that we just naturally assume to be true that we've never thought about. It's a normal human thing. We can't possibly prove everything that we hold as, right? But let's have a little bit more thinking. I mean, there have been a lot of, the Dominicans setting up the Thomistic institutes at universities, for example, the Newman Centers that are doing work in other churches also, the AAAS doing the science for seminarians that I mentioned earlier. So a lot of positive things and a lot of books coming out. I mean, there was a time when I was just getting started as a historian that you could find historical writers, professional historians at universities who would still be quoting Draper and White as if they were true. So things have moved a lot in a positive direction over those last 50 years. So I'm cheered by that. I just hope we're still committed enough to making progress with that kind of stuff. Thanks.
Awesome. I think Father John had a question.
Thank you, Dr. Principe. I know that you're also an expert in the history of alchemy, and many times when we hear about alchemy in the Middle Ages, like, we immediately think of kind of like magical things, right? That can convert lead into gold, and maybe that misunderstanding fosters that divide between faith and science. I mean that, okay, these people in the Middle Ages, they were just superstitious and they would believe anything. Can you give a word about that and how that was actually not so superstitious, or what do you think?
Right, yeah, so this is true that when I'm not talking about science and religion, I actually spend probably more of my time talking about the history of chemistry and the history of alchemy. But, you know, there's a tendency, I'll say one word about alchemy, because if I get started on that, you're going to be here much, much longer. Right. Often we have scientific ideas that are not correct Like there's a possibility of transmuting one metal into another based on a theory that's not correct, that nevertheless gets us very, very far. Okay? Not to talk about alchemy, so a geocentric universe got us really far with measuring the positions of the planets and getting their periods right. The problem, I think, comes when we fall into what I call the arrogance of the present. To think that we have all the answers and somehow everybody before us was just dumb. You know, I've spent time reading a lot of medieval authors and a lot of medieval alchemists too. And sometimes my jaw just drops at what careful observers, what brilliant thoughts these people had. They were no dumber than we are. They stood on a smaller foundation of knowledge, obviously, but wow, the intelligence of the human mind. And once we realize that we're all just a bunch of people trying to make sense out of the world we happen to be born into with the talents that we have, we need to have that kind of camaraderie, I think, with people in the past, to understand their positions, to understand what they're coming from and what they contributed, and their different perspectives, their different viewpoints. We hear a lot about diversity, which is important to hear different peoples with different views who've come up through the world in different places or in different circumstances. That enriches us all, right? But the diversity is in time too, right? Different cultures, different ways of looking at the world. Maybe there are some ideas that someone in the 14th century or the 12th century or the 18th century or 1500 BC had that's worth thinking about again, right? Because they're facing mostly the same kind of problems we're faced with for the most part. The important ones, not the day-to-day ones, but the really big ones. So just in that sense, I would just give a plug for historical understanding as a way. It's also a kind of a way of life. Right?
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but I'm sure Dr. Principe could answer some questions after the talk. Thank you so much again for coming and for your contribution to the Human Lecture Series.
Pleasure. Thank you all.